You're listening to the Archaeology Podcast Network.
This is the American Archaeology Podcast. It's the show where we pull back the veil of cultural resources management, archaeology, and discuss the issues that everyone is concerned about. Welcome to the podcast. Hey everybody, welcome to a special episode of the American Archaeology Podcast. I'm calling it episode 161.2. We are recording straight from the Society for American Archaeology Conference in Albuquerque, New Mexico, 2019, and there's been some stuff going down here, and we're going to talk about it. Hey, before we get started with the show, I just wanted to say a few things here in post. I'm recording this little segment about 5 days after the SAAs ended, and there's been some responses from the Society for American Archaeology, which I'm going to play one from the president, Joe Watkins, at the end of this podcast, so stay tuned for that right before the credits. And also, we talk about a lot of very sensitive topics. Doug gives a well-timed trigger warning here in the show, but I just want to kick this right off and say that because we should have done that right at the beginning. But so if you're sensitive to some of these issues around Me Too, sexual harassment, things like that, then maybe don't listen to this episode. But if you're interested and want to talk about this, then I do welcome your feedback. Chris at archaeologypodcastnetwork.com. You can also go to the show notes over at arcpodnet.com/CRMArcPodcast, and the contact information for all the primary hosts is there. So we're going to get on to this show. Keep in mind, we're passing around microphones and we're in just a room, so there might be some weird noises. There was some weird fuzziness on one of the mics too that I mostly got rid of, but I think I missed a lot of it. And sometimes people didn't have the mic in front of their face. So apologies for all that. I tried cleaning it up, but it is what it is. All right, on to the show. Hey everybody, welcome to the American Archaeology Podcast. This is Chris Webster broadcasting from the SAAs, the 2019 SAAs in Albuquerque, New Mexico. We've secured a room here on the last day, Saturday. Second to the last day for me. I'm heading out tomorrow morning. But and I've gathered together some fellow APN podcasters. I'm going to introduce them right now. The first three you're going to hear are from a brand new podcast that may be out by the time you're listening to this called A Life in Ruins. So Connor, introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Connor Johnen, and I'm a CRM archaeologist working out of Montrose, Colorado.
I'm David. I'm an archaeologist. I work for New South Associates in Georgia, and I work for the Veterans Creation Program.
I'm Carlton Gover. I'm a first-year PhD student at the University of Colorado Boulder and citizen of the Pawnee Nation of Oklahoma.
And Doug.
Hey, everyone.
You bastard. All right, so Bill White from the Sierra Mark podcast is also going to be joining us, but we will get him on when he finds the room that we're sitting in down in the basement of the convention center. Okay, so a lot of things have gone down at this year's SAAs. Let's just kick it off with that. Doug, you were in the Me Too session, and let me first say, let me just give a little background here. So yesterday, which is Friday at the SAAs, there was another Me Too-ish session, and correct me if I'm getting some of the details wrong because I wasn't there. But there's a professor from the University of Alaska who is probably well known by now, and he was had a lot of sexual assault allegations against him. And he was at this session, and a journalist
and harassment. Don't forget the harassment.
Yes, and harassment. Yes, and there was a journalist there who comes to all these conferences. He follows me on Twitter. I follow him. He's all over the place with archaeology. And from what I understand, he escorted this gentleman out of the room just because, this guy's around all these people. All this stuff is coming out about him in the news in the last couple of weeks. And so he escorted this gentleman out of the room. And then the SAA organization banned that journalist from the meetings for the rest of the weekend. And they didn't ban the guy that was escorted out of the room that is a sexual harasser and sexual assaulter. So there's a lot of stuff going around right now. People are pretty pissed off at the SAAs and the whole organization for not having a response to this. And there's a lot of Me Too stuff going around and people talking about it. So Doug, give us a little synopsis on the session you attended today.
Yeah, so this is just going to be a content warning for viewers. If you're not down for profanity, you probably will want to tune out at this point. So to sum up the Me Too session, holy shit. It was intense. So they had people submit anonymous stories, and then they had a panel read off those stories, and I'll be honest, it was a lot. It was like maybe 25 some stories. It was like, yeah.
They all pretty like harrowing.
Yeah. Like
Yeah,
towards the end, man, I got nauseous. It was bad. And it just kept coming. And I was at the front, and I could see their list, and I could see them like scratching off as they went, and I was like, oh man. After the first 10, and I realized there's maybe another 20, it was brutal. It was it was any story you can think of plus more that I had never heard of before. It was bad.
Yeah, and we see a lot of people walking around these SAAs that are, of that generation where that I wouldn't say was accepted, but at least people didn't feel the ability to talk about it very much. And you just got to wonder how many of them are quaking their boots waiting for the hammer to drop. You know what I mean?
So the session ended with a non-anonymous talk. A lady got up and discussed her sexual assault by that professor.
Yeah.
And she talked about how she went to different organizations to get responses. SAA said they didn't have any policy. AIA said they didn't have any policy. The AAAs said they didn't have any policies or way to handle this.
Mm-hmm.
RPA, she went there and they said you can only make a complaint if you are a member, and she wasn't a member. I'm not sure if the professor was a member of RPA and if they could have done anything at all.
Right.
And that was partially because some of the policy of SAA is complain to their policy is basically complain to their employer and complain to RPA, and their employer is already that professor. They already kicked him off, so he'd retired. They denied him emerita status. They've kicked him off he can't go into any of the University of Alaska campus. He can't be at any events that the students are at, and that is actually one of the issues. Is 3 of his victims were here at the conference, but I believe several of them have left because that guy was here. So she finished with that, and they also finished with just throwing it down. Someone just dropped that one of the board members of SAA was fired for sexual assault. But that person's on the board, and so they don't believe that the board will actually be effective in doing anything.
Wow.
Yeah, so no one held back in that session.
Okay, so we were just joined by Dr. Bill White of the American Archaeology podcast, and Bill, we just started talking. Doug was in the Me Too session this afternoon. So, were you in that session?
Yeah, I was also there too. I stayed for a couple hours, but it was really hard to listen to that kind of, vivid recounting of so many different things that happened to so many individuals. We don't know when this stuff was happening, but I have a feeling it's still happening, recently within the last few years. So it's just, mind-blowing to hear all that stuff, but also disheartening, right? To understand that a lot of these folks are still out there, they're still working, and they're still leading groups and taking people into remote situations and kind of turning this into a whole serial thing.
It's a small sample is what you guys heard, right?
I think so.
Yeah, it's a small sample of maybe even more stories that are occurring, and it's crazy to hear about 20 in one discipline, let alone.
Well, it's like the law of statistics and big numbers. It's like if a small percentage is saying something, there's a large percentage that's not.
Absolutely.
They mentioned at the beginning, they said this was only a sample of the many, many responses they had gotten.
Right.
So there's a lot we didn't hear.
Did they offer any kind of like constructive like things for like way archaeologists to conduct themselves in the field, or like how to?
That was not sort of the purpose of the session. It was more about just putting it out there so people couldn't ignore it. So that was the whole session. Is people have been quite upset about the lack of response, and I think the lack of response of many of the professional organizations. And so, that was the whole session was, hey guys, this is here. This is what it is. You can't ignore it.
Right.
And then they did end with a talk sort of summing up. There was 4 points of what people could do. And it was things like, and I apologize, I'm not going to be able to do it justice, but it was,
Sure.
If you see something, do something.
Yeah.
Stand up. Don't force the victim to also be the person who has to go forward. A lot of the stories were about how they were there and basically everyone else just stood around and watched it happen and let it happen. So yeah, there's a bunch of things, but it wasn't sort of like a how-to, as in, step one is, contact these people and do that. But it was more general. These are the 4 things we should sort of be doing.
Cool.
Yeah. Well, and some of my observations too, we're all guys sitting right here. We did invite women onto this panel, but they just have other things to do because they're awesome women and they're doing presentations right now, and they just couldn't make this. So, but I think one of the things, like I was just on I don't do much field work anymore, but I was just on a field work project for the last 2.5 weeks, and a bunch of people I didn't know, and after a few days you get to know the field crew and everybody gets to know each other. And then there was one woman on the crew, but she was the field director, so she wasn't around us a lot, and it was all guys from that standpoint on. And you know what? Guys get around each other and they start making jokes. I don't remember any like specific jokes around this kind of thing, to be honest, but there's always like racial jokes being made. I mean, we're down on the Mexican border. Some people were saying those, and we as a group of professionals need to start not just snickering at those and saying, "Oh, that ignorant bastard," to our heads. We need to stand up and say something and say, "Hey, you can't make jokes like that anymore. Those aren't funny." And it goes the same along the same lines with making jokes about sexual harassment. I mean, people do that. Every one of us has probably seen that in the field, and the women are probably just, ha 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 ha, you guys are cool, I'm like one of the guys. But inside they're like, Jesus, I got to deal with this every day.
Yeah. And in my job, I'm the collections manager and we hire like veterans to curate our collections, and a lot of these guys have just gotten out of the Army and they're like in that kind of mindset, and most of them are like genuinely amazing people, but like sometimes you're in that barracks like scenario or you just got back from duty, and it's holding other guys accountable, I think, is like where we need to get at.
I was in the Navy, and I know when you're in boot camp and then you're deployed, I mean, you do everything you can to forget about what you're doing and where you're doing it, and the people that are dying as a result of your actions, and stuff like that just is 100% accepted, because anything that gets you to laugh in that particular environment is okay in the military. You know what I mean? I think it's becoming less okay in a lot of circumstances, but you get those guys on the front lines and then you put them back in civilian life and they're all of a sudden told everything you've known for the past 4+ years is, no longer acceptable. It's difficult to remove that programming.
Yeah. So it's definitely interesting. But
a lot of times we're dealing with folks who are not vets, right? Yeah. The thing that's so sickening for me is, as a professor, to find out that it's the universities that have been the perpetuators for so long, and so many stories just start with some kind of university type thing or a field school or some scholar that's really set up in a certain part of the country or a certain part of the world that has made a, kind of a side, activity of recruiting individuals, setting this kind of stuff, the psychological stuff that's going on too. And then to find out that they're still teaching students today. That's why I don't know if you discussed it yet, the incident with the professor from Anchorage. I mean, more of it all the time, right? So every time that happens, that's got to happen. And I think we mentioned this before about when it comes to anti-discrimination, the organizations, like I read their anti-harassment statement that was in the program for this, and then it ends up saying, well, we're not an adjudicating force, so we can't really, you can file with the RPA and everything. But the thing that they do have control over is publishing. So individuals who publish through American Antiquity are the ones who, continue those careers, continue working in those parts of the world. They continue, getting tenure and stuff, and all that stuff sets it up for them to continue doing those kind of things to students.
I would say SAAs really fucked this shit up badly. I mean, like it, and I also don't buy that line. They're like, oh, we're not adjudicating, blah blah blah. They're a private organization. They can do what they want. We still have golf courses that ban women because they are quote unquote a private organization. All they have to do is put one line saying, we reserve the right to refuse service or access to conferences or journals to anyone for anything. They are a private organization. There's not a government organization. They can't be sued they could basically be really horrible. And unless it's proof of like discrimination as federally protected, they could basically do it. And being accused of or actually being a sexual assaulter is not a protected class. So if they really wanted to, they could just be like, yeah, actually, we have these accusations. It may not be fair, but you can't come while you have these accusations. And that's, they're all afraid of being like sued or having someone come back and be like, oh, that's not right, it's just an accusation or stuff like that. I mean, let's be honest, like the guy went through a process and was found guilty, not by criminal courts, but like he was found guilty by the university system. So that's at least one other organization. Actually, the Alaska, I'm going to get the name wrong, but it's the Alaska Archaeology Association or Anthropology. They actually came out and just said they revoked his lifetime achievement award, everything, and they said that was enough for them. And they are the same, just a
a little smaller.
Yeah, a professional organization for archaeology. They did it. They had no problem. So I'm sorry, SAA. They really dropped it, and that is complete and utter bullshit about like, oh, we can't do anything. Yeah, you can do stuff. People may not like it, but you can do stuff.
Yeah, there has to be some built-in mechanisms for us to be able to deal with this. If it's someone has pending sexual harassment charges, maybe that's something that we need to be like, hey, you can't come in until this is solved or resolved in some way, or something that doesn't allow this to keep going on.
Well, the one thing the SAA does have is their ethics policy, and they can revoke a membership if you violate their ethics policy. And while they do need revision to their ethics policy, the guy undoubtedly has violated it, right?
I mean, watch them revoke ours for doing the podcast.
I mean, when I saw this post about the Anchorage professor on Facebook, and I was really distraught that the SAAs didn't do anything. I was in a fraternity in undergrad, and the amount of seminars that I had to attend and what would happen to fraternities or sororities that were accused of this, where they would just they would be immediately put on probation. And I had an incident in undergrad when I was on the IFC council that there was a Men Can Stop Rape presentation that was coming to town, and a bunch of the fraternities only made it mandatory for 3 brothers from each fraternity to go, and they laughed about it.
Wow.
My fraternity was not one of those. We were upset. The sororities were equally very upset. It was on the state news when they found out the women the sororities sent all their girls. Mandatory for them to go to a Men Can Stop Rape presentation, and the fraternities only sent 3 or 4 brothers as mandatory, and it blew up in their face. And the backlash from that, just being in that atmosphere and like watching this get passed when I was in IFC, like, you guys are idiots. And to see something like the SAAs where this is my professional atmosphere, like I expect these people to act professionally and do the right thing. And the fact that there are colleagues of mine that don't feel comfortable to be at a professional meeting, which we have to come to in order to network and present our research and to build relationships, because SAAs has allowed an individual who's been found guilty, regardless if it's not a criminal system, but by a university system, to attend these things. It's just, it makes me sick.
Well, if they're like anything like the university I go to, we have to take several different anti-harassment, anti-discrimination courses, while we also watch in the news professors at our institution get ripped for going through the same process. So it's not like this was a mystery. The stories that I was hearing were kind of like, how is this in 2019? You had to have watched the training. You can't really even get your course registered unless you've done the training. How are you able to just continue doing this when you've already taken the training and you know what's going to happen if you do it? And then just to have it happen year after year is just brazen and crazy. By not taking a stand, it just keeps it going.
Now, I have a question for you guys, because you guys have been doing this much longer than the 3 of us, me, Connor, and David. Was the SAAs, I know we've got a new SAA president. Were there a bunch of other transitionary positions this SAAs?
The executive director is brand new.
Right.
She took over, and after Toby Brimsek was like 20 plus years, right? Yeah, so there's been a kind of a massive change at the helm, and I've talked to Una Schmidt, who's now the executive director, and she seems very forward thinking, but she comes in as most executive directors of large nonprofit organizations. She has no idea about archaeology, right? She came in as an executive director with that kind of experience. So now she's got to deal with this whole system from that standpoint.
Well, and I know Joe Watkins too, and he seems like a stand-up guy, and he's done a lot. So I think that it ends up being poor timing that stuff that has been festering for years and years and years ends up happening on his watch. But if there is a person that I can think that would, be the right kind of person to have there, it is Joe Watkins. So I am more confident in Joe than many other people who have been president at SAA. But this is the third SAA I've ever gone to, and the last time was when we were in 2014, Austin. I don't go to the SAA. I just don't.
Yeah.
I know I've been to the student reception these past couple years, and every time, I forget the former president of the SAA's name off the top of my head.
I don't remember either.
Susan Chandler.
Susan Chandler.
And she gave her present. She kicked off her SAA presidency last year in D.C. by coming to the student reception, and her whole speech was on sexual harassment. And if we're mentioning that there's certain people they can go to, if you feel safe at any point in time, and just went through it. And she did it again this year, and it's I think it's been phenomenal to have the students, that's how their SAA is kicked off, to try to make them feel safe. And at least that there are people within SAA hierarchy that are thinking about these things, at least trying to get students to be aware of it.
Okay, well, let's take a break for a second and come back and bring this back to CRM Archaeology. Back in a minute. Hey, everybody. No advertisement today from the Archaeology Podcast Network. I just want to encourage everyone to stand up and say something, male, female. It doesn't matter who you are, whether it's your first day in the field or your 51st day in the field or your 5,000th day in the field. It doesn't matter. Stand up, say something. All right, back to the show. All right, we're back on the CRM Archaeology Podcast, SAA 2019 edition. And before we get into discussing CRM Archaeology, Bill, I know we talked about this on the podcast probably at the SHAs when we recorded, but since we're talking about this right now, remind us what happened at the SHAs this year in St. Louis.
Yeah, no problem, since we were all snowed in. But I think a lot of people actually, in fact, they showed up. They were there for the entire Me Too session there. So at SHA 2019, we had some folks who organized a panel be on the podcast, and they started a group on Facebook that gives resources and support anonymously through Facebook to folks who have been victims of this entire situation. And I remember one of the biggest things that had the difference between what happened today, which today I have a feeling was powerful and well needed, because this organization is, twice or maybe even 3 times bigger than the SHA. So they've got way more archaeologists and more individuals go to this one, right? So to have so many people pack a much bigger room and hear these kind of stories, I think you're reaching a bigger audience with this. But I didn't stay till the end. I mean, it was just too much to listen to story after story. And after, 98, 100 and something minutes of hearing story after story, and there was no end in sight, I mean, it just got to be too much, right? To realize that I'm part of that whole system and, not really knowing what to do to fix it. But at SHA, there was an actual end game that ended up happening where in the room were folks who worked at universities and agencies and the RPA and stuff. And so it was more of a discussion, and in the process of that discussion, folks pointed out that the RPA has at that time in January 2019, had no statement on harassment. And some folks from the RPA were there in attendance and raised their hand and said, "Oh, we're working on it." And within, a day, half a day, they already had some new anti-harassment statement on the RPA. So the stuff can move much faster. Like you were saying, Doug, I mean, the idea that we can do nothing is not really a valid excuse for doing nothing, because I just watched the Register of Professional Archaeologists. They said that they were already working on it, and they were ahead of the curve, which is, absolutely laudable, since what we're seeing at our nationwide conferences is that this is, finally coming to a head, and rightfully so, and I hope it brings change. But after SHA, I felt like there actually was some change. Companies reached out and said that they would provide resources because, they have obligations under the law. And a lot of the companies had, protocols in place. The Facebook group is set up so they can connect with legal aid and stuff from different organizations so that folks don't have to stand in front of an entire audience and recap their whole story. They can reach out to a lawyer through Facebook to try and get things done. But I felt like at SHA, things, moved forward. And I'm really hoping that maybe tomorrow or the day after something happens and I see that SAA has advanced as well.
Yeah. Also, just like another detail is the University of Alaska actually wrote SAA asking them to ban that professor. But
wow.
I know also on Twitter, a lot of people have been like, "Oh, SAA should not have kicked out Michael." And I'm gonna say something controversial here. Actually, they did what they were supposed to do. They followed the policy they had. It's just a crap policy. No, like the policy is so he, in a sense, harassed the sexual harasser by asking him to leave and making a hostile place. But their policy right now is basically completely neutral and just saying you can't do that. There's no nuance of like, well, if someone shouldn't be here, they shouldn't be here.
Right.
So yeah, I mean, I have to give it to them. They actually did follow through with their policy in that one case. It's just not a good policy.
Right now, there is an open letter to the SAAs that was, I think it has like 500 signatures on it.
Is it 500?
Yeah.
I signed it like 3 hours ago and there was 200.
Yeah. Yeah. So, and it's calling on the SAAs to get its shit together and figure this out. Yeah, that's just amazing. So I think the broader community is really going to have more of an impact to put the SAA higher ups in gear, because this is something everyone's been talking about on social media. I mean, we had a friend today,
he's
not even here, saw a Facebook post and tagged us and is like, what the fuck is going on? Is this actually true? And I'm like, unfortunately, yeah.
Is there could you say what the resource where you can find that? So for our listeners,
It's actually, if you're listening to this right now, I reposted that document to the Archaeology Podcast Network Facebook page. So go check it out at facebook.com/archpodnet. And as soon as we're done recording this, I'll go pin that to the top of the page so it stays there.
Cool.
So you can find it.
Yeah. So, and in the people that are even signing it right now, I know this is a former professor of mine, David Anderson from Radford. He's not even here. And this is getting around. The people are signing it. So I'm really happy that the community itself is kind of taking a big step into straighten this whole thing.
And the petition is to get the SAAs to...
let's see. I think that it calls on 6 points. Let me just pull it up real quick. There's a long little speech or explanation. It's 1, to issue a formal apology for the above events, being what the debacle with the former Alaska professor. 2, update their sexual harassment policy, which has not been updated since 2015. 3, train all staff, both on the ground and those in the senior and organizational positions, on how to implement these policies if situations such as this arise again. 4, follow the lead of University of Alaska and the Alaska Anthropological Association in barring David Yesner from all subsequent events. 5, refund and give compensation to all those impacted, including the survivors and the allies who cannot fully participate in the conference as a direct result of the SAA's action. And 6, fund counseling for anyone impacted by SAAs in action. That's a lot.
Yeah.
Yeah, they can do it though.
We're anthropologists after all. So.
Yeah.
I mean, the biggest thing is the change of culture, right? So anyone who's listening now, do not do that. Don't do the kind of stuff that we were just hearing. Definitely don't break the law. Definitely don't cause problems. Not just for women, but everybody, right?
Right.
Yeah, don't be a dick.
More, yeah,
Treat
no
people
more
with
harassment,
respect.
right?
And call it out when you see it.
So all we can hope is over the, eons that it takes for a professor to finally wither away. I'm hoping that it takes eons, right? But the way I'm going, it won't. At any rate, I'm hoping that this can be the tipping point that then it just gets more and more diminished, right? Until eventually it's just not around. I really hope it happens fast, but from what I was just hearing earlier today, I don't see where this is going to end fast. There's folks who are supposedly notable scholars who are running projects that have done, dozens and dozens of years of work and had students go on. I mean, this is fully throughout the entire industry. There's companies that are just turning an eye and not helping people and letting folks that have been at the company for decades just get away with stuff, right? So learning where, telling jokes and stuff like that, some folks never heard that they weren't supposed to do that. Well, now don't do that kind of stuff. And then move forward. Get training, but also pay attention to what folks are saying. Pay attention to what's happened to others and just, don't do that. That's all I can really say. That's the only, we need to learn more. We need to do better as, individuals and stuff. And I really hope to help individuals who have had this kind of stuff happen to them. And I really just hope that this can be the year 2019 that we move forward as archaeology, and that this is where it starts ending.
Yeah, absolutely. So in the last part of this segment, let's bring this back to CRM, because all of us in this room have either or currently work in cultural resource management. And this is the CRM Archaeology podcast. So as I alluded to earlier, I was on a project just last week, and there's always inappropriate jokes, especially if you're crew chiefs, leadership positions, you've got to stand up. And I always learned in the Navy, punish in private, praise in public. However, people that make those jokes in a public setting, and by public, I mean around your peers, you need to tell them not to say that kind of stuff around their peers. I mean, if they're going to continue with it, then you pull them aside at the end of the field day and you say, listen, your time on this crew is limited if you're going to keep doing this stuff. I've told you in front of everybody. I'm telling you now privately, knock it off. So
I guess the next thing is, what do we do about the retribution when you get to be the person who's a killjoy, who's always telling them not have no fun because we can't make these jokes, right? Because that's what I was hearing, that supervisors were just kind of blowing it off, or, well, that person's a jerk, I don't want her out here anymore, you know what I'm saying? And so, it's two things. I really hope that folks do learn those lessons when they're first starting off, so that 20 years later, they actually have internalized that. But what do we do now for the companies and the folks that are just kind of blowing it off right now?
I think we're in a good situation, to be honest, because the Me Too movement has got such strong power that people who are advocating for this are the good people now. You're right. Maybe a few years ago, somebody, especially a woman, who said, I don't like these jokes being said around in this crew, they might be like, people are saying, oh, we don't want her around, but those people have the power now, I think.
Yeah,
it's getting there.
But we had a whole civil rights movement, right? And then look at what we got now.
Yeah,
look at our president. Those things we thought we buried, right? We're never
That's
really
true.
buried. They were just still there. No one was acting out because they knew they'd get fired, or they knew they'd get arrested for saying that kind of stuff.
Right.
I'd also challenge those folks who are like, oh, you're being a killjoy? Man, up your game. Usually most of those jokes are the lowest form of humor. Honestly, I'm just not gonna come any slack.
Yeah.
Seriously, you can make smart jokes that aren't prison rape jokes. You can make.
There's a whole level. All of the levels are above that. All of them are above that one.
There's plenty of jokes we can make about Scotland, right now. Even New Mexico.
Bring it. Bring your A game, Chris. Bring your A game. That's just it. I'm sorry. I have no sympathy for those people who are like, oh, it's gonna be a killjoy. It's Jesus, dude. Can't you do more with your life? Can't you up your game a little bit in your humor? Does it have to, I'm sorry, I'm just not going to come slack. I expect more from people. I'm just not going to be like, oh, I'm sorry, dude. We're going to let you say really offensive and stupid shit because, you're not that bright.
Because that's the only way we can have a good time on this crew.
Yeah, no, that's no. We don't do that.
Yeah, totally.
What I was always astonished is hearing the stories of just straight up assault. Yeah. And that somehow folks thought that was okay. I mean, that was the thing that was disturbing me the most, that it wasn't, I could have been on crews, right? Where this kind of stuff, they could have been talking about crews that I was on. And because a lot of these things happened, in secret or in the shadows or whatever, and the folks never brought it out and stuff, I could have been there and did nothing because I had no idea what was going on. But also the fact that this is a rampant thing that has been happening, right? That was the thing that was so shocking to me.
Well, also, from the stories, if you guys were there, is these folks, they're predators. This is not, most people are thinking this is innocent jokes that, that's the blowback. Everyone's like, oh, you're being a killjoy. No, man, these stories are about straight up predators. And you could tell from the behavior, because all the stories are about how they isolate the individual. They get them alone in the lab, or they get power over them. So they're like, oh, hey, you want this project? Or, we might be hiring next week, for that next project. And they'll be like, oh, what do I need to do? And he's like, just make me happy. And that was a creepy line that was said by one of the people.
Jay?
And
Oh man.
Yeah, that was one of the creepy lines, and that's just it. But these people, like all the stories, basically, it's rarely in front of people. Some of the jokes that make people uncomfortable will be in that, but that's like, those are predators testing out the limits. So they'll test out these sort of creepy jokes and this stuff. And if people laugh it off and don't say anything, then they push further and further. And that was basically all these stories about, like, it started out with just like, yeah, some creepy jokes, maybe invaded my personal space, to like straight up predator threatening to destroy careers and that stuff. And then it's like, people are confusing this idea of like, oh, killjoy and I can't say bad jokes anymore, with actually a lot of the problem is not just bad jokes. It is like sexual predators and just horrible people going. And yeah, I mean, you saw how many stories there were, Bill. There was just, it was nothing but predators.
It was bad. And all, psychological gaslighting, so that if they did come forward and expose them, then others would say, no, he wouldn't have done that. That couldn't have happened, So setting the whole stage up so that they're, freer from prosecution. It's harder to bring a case against them, and that others will just look the other way. And then hearing that others did look the other way when they found out evidence.
Yeah, I'm just hearing all these stories, just thinking like how hard it would be for a student, especially if it was their advisor who did stuff. Because then that's the added thing of like, okay, there might be an opportunity behind this, but if they bring something up, the retribution on behalf of the advisor themselves, like that just will absolutely destroy.
Yeah, it would affect their career.
Yeah,
it's affecting their everyday life and their future career going forward. And that's
so you look outside of this field, and when somebody stands up in a high profile situation, you might think, the industry's gonna back them up. But I don't really follow sports very much. But let's bring up Colin Kaepernick. Doing what he believes in, and then he hasn't worked in football since. You know what I mean? And I mean, he's getting some other stuff, I guess, but he's still seriously dealing with all this blowback, and it's a massively high profile thing and high profile position, and still having to deal with that.
So Ford was mentioned maybe like 3 or 4 times by the victim saying, so I should have come forward, but no, I'm not going to do that. So that was actually a lot of the letters where people just saying, yeah, we know the system. This sucks, but I'm not going to like go through that entire process of being belittled and told I'm a liar and my career destroyed. That was a big theme in a lot of the stories.
Yeah. So we were just joined by Dr. Kelsey Nowak-Myers, a CRM archaeologist working in a CRM field. So we're just talking in this segment. We already mentioned in the first segment that we recorded about the Me Too panel that was today, and all the stories. Doug was out there, Bill was there, and we're transitioning now and talking about CRM and the challenges there, and really holding people accountable to not make these kinds of jokes. What's been your experiences in CRM? I mean, without getting into any detail if you don't want to, but I just want to know, how are people receiving this, where you're at?
Sure. I think that my department is unique because except for one in my office, we have all female staff. So it's a pretty interesting place to work right now because, and the only male field archaeologist we have, he's only been there for a week. So we had a brief period there where we had an all-female CRM department, and we did have male employees in the department, but they worked remotely in sort of a senior capacity. And so, I mean, there's other discussions about that too, that we've got, all of the junior staff are female for the most part and working in office, where you've got senior male staff that are free to work from home or work remotely or have more flexible employment in terms of where they're located. I think that in my own experience is definitely a thing. I know when I used to work for a state archaeology program, working with a large crew of 90 people, there was hesitancy, I think, from some of the leadership to appoint females as crew chiefs because the crew's not going to listen to you.
Jeez.
And so, if you got a crew of 90 people and most of the people that are pushing shovels are female, or, a disproportionate percentage, more than 50%, and yet all of the middle level management are, for the most part, guys with beards,
right? Regardless
of their level of experience.
Right.
I won't say what state, but I definitely, going in with a master's degree and being a crew chief and having several years of experience, had somebody over me as assistant site supervisor who was not even trained as an archaeologist, but they were friends with the person who was the site supervisor. And he knew that I had more experience in training than he did. And so he would always defer to me and would say, I know it doesn't make sense that I'm in charge of you, but I have to come over here and tell you when you can do things. And I appreciate your patience with me. And he would, solicit opinions and things like that. And so I think it's definitely still an issue. And I had made comments when I went back to the Midwest from working on the East Coast about the difference between the culture there and what you see in the Midwest. And I had said, that it's so much of a boys' club in some places still out there. And they're like, oh, well, you don't see that here. And I was like, really? Like, look around, and I've worked now in the Plains too, which is even potentially in some places less friendly toward women in the field. But there are other aspects there that have to do with working traditional cultures and remote, like really remote sites. Like, am I going to go out into the mountains by myself in a 4-wheel drive vehicle where there are bears and I don't have a firearm?
Right.
And there's no cell signal, right? Right. Right. So
I'm shaving tomorrow.
Sorry,
there's a lot of beards in this room right now.
Yeah.
I'm feeling pretty safe,
Yeah.
actually.
Yeah. So it is just it's a standard thing. Like to the point where I made a joke when I was working as a crew chief because I learned how to knit and I knit myself a beard to wear as a face warmer during the winter to say, look, I have a beard now. You have to listen to me as a joke.
Nice.
But, it's a thing
for
sure in CRM.
I got to ask you on your all women organization up until a week ago that you're working with. Of course, they're all making crude jokes about men, right? Like that's what happens when all women get together because that's what all men do to get together, right? So no, that's not true.
No.
What is up with guys? Seriously.
Like I don't know that we ever. I don't know that it's ever a thing that we talk about. I just had noticed, I was sitting there leading like a lunch and learn on historic ceramics identification. And I was looking around the table and I was like, every single person at this table is like me. Like I'm like talking to someone who's my size and female and, is going to be put out there and seen as somebody that may not have a lot of experience or doesn't know what they're talking about just because of what they look like and who they are and how they sound. I've had that too. Nobody's going to listen to you because you have a tiny little voice, so. Do
you see a shift, a gender shift in archaeology happening? Because I'm seeing a lot more women on crews, to be honest.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. And that's obviously a good thing. It makes our field stronger, for sure.
I can definitely say, and growing up in the past, 8 years I've been an archaeologist, like my undergrad was mostly female, and I was like one of the only males in my undergrad, which I thought was cool. But like when I got into, I had some like female advisors that were just spectacular, and then when I got into grad school, I'd say it was about 50-50, right, when we were there. But I know in some CRM crews and some other academic spots, that's not how it is. So I can't. I'm a little biased, I guess, but
yeah.
So now that we've spent like 40 minutes repeating to the SAA, they did do recently a pilot study looking at this stuff. So we could ask them, because they own all the data and information and output, what the gender breakdown is. But it's probably close to what you guys are describing, a lot more women younger.
Well, and we, so at the SAAs, we did some interviews with people, just brief interviews about, we're asking a bunch of questions. And one of them was, where do you want to see archaeology go in the future? And it was almost universal. Almost every person was like, we want to see more diversity. We want to see better representation of communities in these discussions. So I think it's on the mind of a lot of people. And we hope that it keeps being there and existing, and we're working to, make this better and more inclusive and, have better representation at this point.
Yeah.
Thinking about that, I just realized that a lot of people, because we had to go during this poster session, grab people to interview, that the people that turned us down were actually mostly women that were graduate students, because and a lot of times they said, no one's going to care what I have to say.
Really?
Oh.
Yeah, I got a couple of those. They're like, why does anyone care what I have to say? And I was like, why wouldn't people want to hear what you have to say? Yeah. So that was just from what you just talked about. I was like, oh shit, like those were all my responses.
Yeah.
All the individuals that we asked to interviews that were men, they were like, yeah, sure. I mean, sometimes you got to push them a little bit, but it was mostly the ones that were female that were like, no, why would anyone care?
I've actually had that in 6 years of podcasting and hundreds of interviews that I've done. I've encountered that a lot. a shockingly high amount, where somebody says, nobody wants to hear about this, nobody wants to hear me speak about this, and sometimes, to be honest, it's a little bit of, stage fright about talking on a podcast. But in another case, it really is, they're thinking, nobody wants to hear me say, I'm not qualified to talk about this. And like, listen, I found you because of a paper you wrote that was amazing, or an article, or a book, a chapter, or something like that. I was like, you're absolutely qualified to do this. And then once you get them on and you get them comfortable, then they're just talking about their stuff, which I like to do. So maybe that gives them confidence the next time something like that comes around. It's
a well studied social phenomenon that basically, so if you were to, it's an average, so not everyone, but women tend to only do stuff if they are 100% confident. So they'll only apply for a job if they meet 100% of the requirements. Whereas guys are like, yeah, man, 30%. That's pretty close. Like that's like almost half. Half is almost right there. And so like, yeah, and I do see it when like applying for jobs. Like usually there's a gender breakdown where like women tend to be way more qualified, and we get some of these guys who are just like, yeah, I think I could be that. I could do that with no experience. And it's a pretty well studied social phenomenon. And it's, yeah.
Kind of summarizes the podcast.
Yeah, I had to really seriously consider when I was doing like my first peer review publication, how do I want to represent myself? Do I want to only use initials? And if I publish with both my maiden name and my married name, then everyone's going to know that I'm female anyway. But if I publish with only initials, are they going to know that I'm female anyway? So is there any way that I can present myself as gender neutral in my publication name? And that was like a thing I struggled with and asked a lot of professors and other professionals, what would you do? What have you done? Why did you make the choice you did? And does that ever happen to a guy? I got a variety of responses. A lot of people really cautioned me against using both last names. And they suggested that I just use my maiden name. But that's like there were other things that went into that too. But I had a story. I remember I was an undergrad. I asked way back then one of my professors, and she said, well, I decided to use my married name only, and then I got divorced and then remarried, but I went back to my maiden name. She said she also had a grad student who had decided not only to use not a married name, but to change her name entirely, her first and last name, because she didn't want to be associated with her own personality that people in her real life knew her from in publication. So she essentially was writing under a pen name professionally.
That's such a unique problem to women too, because guys don't often change their names, with few exceptions. Guys don't often hyphenate or do anything. And I mean, in a world where you're statistically likely to get divorced rather than stay married, the divorce rate is higher than the staying married rate. Women women have to consider that, because your publication history could be, several different names, and then it's hard to find.
So like Chip Colwell Janthafon, right? He's recently done this, right? So he was always a model for, guys can also change their last name or incorporate their spouse in their last name, right? And so more than just a gender thing, but tying your identity to another person, that's always uncertain, regardless of, however you want to identify yourself or your relationship, that if you choose to change your own personal identification, that's linked to your publication record. Now, it's not as much of an issue, I would say, today, with everything being online for the most part. You can find almost any published source online, and you can certainly link things through your own, whatever website you have or that you use to list your publications. And then, of course, in your resume, you can list everything you've done. But yeah, I don't see that generally applying to most guys that are publishing as professional archaeologists, and that's like a huge thing that the other half or a majority of archaeologists are now having to think about.
So the name thing isn't something I have to worry about, but I have to worry about what I write, because I know who's going to read it. So do you also have to worry about what you write because of who's going to read it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you can move regions, you can quit a job and work somewhere else, but people are still going to know who you are, and they're going to find you and your things. And then, just like what happened here at the conference, it's like I attend these conferences, and there are conferences that I have stopped attending because I don't want to see people that I know are going to be there. I would say that what happened at this SAA is not unique. It just happened to be one where a lot of attention ended up being paid to it, and now it's, sort of it's snowballing, which is a good thing to bring attention to it, but it's not unique. This is not the first time this has happened, and I'm sure it won't be the last time, and not the only conference.
Yeah, just imagine, much like a field school or a short-term ARC project, when you bring a bunch of people who may not know each other into a single space for a short period of time, how much happens that somebody might be even shocked when they're finished, like, did that just happen to me? And then almost not even believe it, you know what I mean? So, all right, well, we got to wrap this show up. I've got to help my wife tear down our exhibit up in the exhibit hall. So
you will be forever. You will break the.
That's right. So that's right.
Your wife listens to the podcast, right?
I don't think she does. She listens to me enough.
There's potential for my wife to hear it, so I will also break the forever, and Doug will also.
There you go.
Notebook.
All right. Well, I'd like to thank all the people that came down for this. We had pretty good representation from the Archaeology Podcast Network here this year, I would say. Half of this panel before Kelsey showed up was the new Life in Ruins podcast, so check that out.
What up?
Check that out on the Archaeology Podcast Network or wherever you find podcasts. It will probably be out, if you're listening to this in real time, by the end of April if all goes well, or a little bit sooner.
Fingers crossed.
Fingers crossed. So, and then the lights just went out us again because of the motion sensor.
Closing time.
And I would like to thank... she had a meeting, and I'm glad she got down here because I forgot to DM her the room number. She must have asked my wife or just found us.
You came into another door. How did you?
Yeah.
Went on a search. I opened somebody's session.
I got lost down here.
So again, thanks, Kelsey, for joining us. That was fantastic to have your perspective on this. And again, thanks everybody else.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Okay, as promised, here's the about 2-minute response from Joe Watkins, president of the Society for American Archaeology.
My name is Joe Watkins, and I am the president of the Society for American Archaeology. SAA's elected leadership and its staff heartfully apologize to individual members and the membership in general who were impacted by events that occurred at the Albuquerque meeting. We are listening to you and are moving forward with short-term and long-term actions to ensure that such issues don't happen again. First, we will update SAA's sexual harassment and anti-harassment policies. Next, we will provide training to on-the-ground staff and those in senior leadership positions on effective and compassionate implementation of those policies. Third, we will provide a professional counselor for our members beginning at the 2020 annual meeting in Austin, Texas. Last but not least, we will improve our communication internally with our committee and task force members and chairs, and externally with you, the members, via social media and other mechanisms. This is an evolving process, one that we will continue to work on and work through. Please let us know if you would like to work with us. SAA is its membership. Without you, we can't move the profession forward.
That's it for another episode of the CRM Archaeology Podcast. Links to some of the items mentioned on the show are in the show notes for this podcast, which can be found at www.arcpodnet.com/CRMArcPodcast. Please comment and share anywhere you see the show. If you'd like us to answer a question on a future episode, email us. Use the contact form on the website, or just email chris@archaeologypodcastnetwork.com. Support the show and the network at arcpodnet.com/members. Get some swag and extra content while you're there. Send us show suggestions and interview suggestions. We want this to be a resource for field technicians everywhere, and we want to know what you want to know about. Thanks everybody for joining me this week. Thanks also to the listeners for tuning in, and we'll see you in the field. Goodbye.
See you later.
Bye-bye.
再见.
Later.
Bye.
Doug's putting his hands up. We're in the same room, and he's counting down with his hands. I don't understand this. I don't even know what's going on. He's not even going to say it in the microphone.
Goodbye.
Damn you, Doug. This show is produced and recorded by the Archaeology Podcast Network, Chris Webster and Tristan Boyle, in Reno, Nevada, at the Reno Collective.
This has been a presentation of the Archaeology Podcast Network. Visit us on the web for show notes and other podcasts at www.archpodnet.com. Contact us at chris@archaeologypodcastnetwork.com.
Thanks again for listening to this episode and for supporting the Archaeology Podcast Network. If you want these shows to keep going, consider becoming a member for just $7.99 US a month. That's cheaper than a venti quad eggnog latte. Go to archpodnet.com/members for more info.
America. We are endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. By honoring your sacred vocation of nursing, you impact your family, your friends, and your community. At Grand Canyon University, our online RN to BSN, MSN, or DNP degree programs allow you to balance online coursework with local in-person clinical, practicum, or immersion hours. Find your purpose at GCU. Private, Christian, affordable. Visit gcu.edu.